Italian designs on the North African coast are well documented. Since Roman times, Italians have lived, worked, and died along the southern Mediterranean. Before Rome was even an empire, it used North Africa as a base for colonization. In the new Italian state, attempts were made to emulate this geopolitical relationship. However, in the late 19th century, the failure of Italian diplomatic overtures in Tunisia had angered Italian politicians and nationalists who had been trying to economically penetrate the North African state for decades. Italians feared that they would lose out on territory once more, this time to their German allies. Mazzini was one of the first Italian patriots to openly make the assertion that the Roman Empire should be emulated. He said, quote, "Tunis, Tripoli, and the Cyrenaica belong to that part of Africa up to the Atlas Mountains that truly fits the European system. Already in the past, the flag of Rome was unfurled on top of the Atlas Mountains. The Mediterranean became known as Mare Nostrum, our sea," unquote. Beyond these shallow historical arguments, a base in North Africa was thought to greatly strengthen the defenses of mainland Italy, with Tobruk being home to one of the great natural harbors in the area. The first step in this colonial action was for Italian diplomats to reach assurances with the rest of Europe. First, the Germans gave their support. Next, the Austrians gave their begrudging acquiescence. The hard part would prove to be garnering support from France and Great Britain, as both had interests in the Ottoman state. France would finally submit, but with a caveat. Italy had to recognize their colonies in Chad and Central Africa. Italians were under the erroneous impression that once the vast desert of Libya was claimed by Europeans, the land would magically revert back to a garden of plenty, as it was in Roman times. This claim was supported by statesmen, economists, and everyday Italians. In fact, this last group was promised vast swathes of land in Libya, and once colonization was completed, the former vilayet was promised to become a new home for emigrating Italians. The final linchpin to invasion lay with the British agreeing. The British had vast naval armaments in Cyprus and Malta, and could effectively swamp the Italian mainland if they so chose. Italy received their tacit agreement from Britain, which stated, quote, "His Britannic Majesty's government have no aggressive or ambitious designs in regard to Tripoli. If at any time an alteration of the status quo should take place, it would be their object that, so far as compatible with the obligations resulting from the treaties, which at present form part of the public law of Europe, such alteration should be in conformity with Italian interests," unquote. As with Tunisia, Italy's initial forays into undermining Ottoman power in Libya were economical. Italian businesses and banks were instrumental in the distribution of Italian capital into Libyan markets. Exports to Italy were increased, and schools began teaching the Italian language to such an extent that, after Arabic, Italy was the second most spoken language. The clearest example of peaceful penetration, penetrazione pacifica, was the Bank of the Holy Seal, or the Banco di Roma. With a healthy investment of 5 million lire, the bank was instrumental in subverting Ottoman power in the region. They also laid the groundwork for the initial colonization of the fertile areas by Italian entrepreneurs. When the Italians arrived, they ran into reality. Charles Wellington Furlong wrote of Tripoli and its environs, quote, "Tripoli is a land of contrasts. Rains, which turn the dry wadis, which are riverbeds, into raging torrents, and cause the country to blossom overnight. Then, month after month without a shower over the parched land. Suffocating days and cool nights, full harvests one year, famine the next. Without a breath of air, heat saturated, yellow sand wastes bank against a sky of violet blue," unquote. In the face of this peaceful penetration, the Young Turks put up roadblocks designed to reassert Ottoman authority in the area. They demanded all economic concessions to Italy be rescinded and that future projects would be doled out to nations which were competing with Italy. Italians who were in the throes of hysterical nationalism saw this assertion of Ottoman national sovereignty as a challenge to their designs. Italy was now on the warpath. Both center parties adopted nationalist positions, and in the coming election, nationalists would gain seats in parliament, making them another voice for the hard right. Italian politicians were understandably wary of this new strain of militarism. Giolitti considered war useless. Nevertheless, he latched on to popular sentiment instead of standing by his beliefs. If war began, he wanted to make sure to contain the war to North Africa. Giolitti was obviously nervous. He said pathetically, quote, "What if, after we attack Turkey, the Balkans move? And what if a Balkan war provokes a clash between the two groups of powers and a European war? Is it wise that we saddle ourselves with the responsibility for setting fire to the powder?" Unquote. Regardless, Giolitti and the Italian government believed there was such a thing as a, quote, relatively cheap colonial war, unquote. In May 1911, the Agadir crisis threatened such a European war. German battleships cruised off the coast of Morocco to intimidate French troops stationed there. This was done in the hopes of Germany being granted concessions elsewhere in Africa. Germany's diplomatic approach was described by Edward Crankshaw as, quote, to stamp on his neighbor's foot and display aggrieved surprise if he received a kick in return. This aggressive incident sent alarm bells ringing throughout Europe as tension ramped up between the belligerents. Italy now felt compelled to act. If they did not, it was felt that Germany would seize the initiative from under them, as the French had with Tunisia and as Britain had with Egypt. Italian yellow journalism was proving instrumental in bolstering the calls for war. Far-right papers, as well as liberal economic reviews, all believed war would be a solvent to the woes plaguing Italy. Government officials believed they could invade and conquer Libya relatively easily. They also falsely believed that the local population would view the Italian army as liberators. Before the invasion, Italy was right to be optimistic. There was no means of supplying Libya once a blockade was put in place, and there were few Ottoman regulars in Libya. The division which usually garrisoned the area was split up to put down the rebellions in Yemen. In the words of Charles Stevenson, quote, public opinion in Italy, as expressed by the press, would cause the downfall of the government if it failed to do in Tripoli what it perceived France was likely to do in Morocco, unquote. On September 15, 1912, Italian politicians agreed war would begin in November. Almost immediately, the timetables for invasion were pushed up. October would be the new official beginning. The initial objectives for the campaign were the main ports and cities on the coast. They hoped this would neutralize any Ottoman resistance, while also securing supplies by sea. Occupation of the interior would happen at a later date. Altogether, it was deemed no more than 40,000 troops would be necessary to pacify a country 5 times the size of Italy. The main masterminds behind the invasion of Libya were Ministers of War Paolo Spingardi and Chief of Staff Albert Pollio. They were in the process of modernizing and re-equipping the army when the calls for invasion were issued. Nevertheless, the Italians were able to accurately predict Ottoman numbers in Libya, having created an intelligence section called Ufficio Uno. In total, the Ottoman Empire had approximately 6,000 regular infantry throughout Libya. This did not include territorial troops or local militia bands, which were deemed negligible. For reasons which remain a mystery, the Ottoman authorities kept believing the lie that Italy was not about to invade. All they sent to their men in the field were 20,000 1893 rifles and a few pieces of light artillery. In reality, it's fair to assume the Ottomans had plenty of issues elsewhere, and the men simply weren't available for transport. Against hope, Ottoman diplomats begged for peace. On the eve of war, they said the Italians could take the whole province in all but name. They just needed to claim the Ottomans were still nominally in control. This agreement would have been much the same agreement the Ottomans had with Great Britain regarding Egypt. This would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives and 40 years of incessant warfare and atrocities, but Italy refused. Charles Stevenson says, quote, "No reply could have satisfied them. They wanted a war as a matter of policy in order to satisfy public opinion," unquote. On September 28, 1911, a state of war existed between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Italy. Stevenson continues, quote, "There is an Arabic saying to the effect that he who takes his donkey up a minaret must take it down again." Italy carried their donkey to the very top. They were to discover that getting it down again was a somewhat more complex and infinitely more arduous task, unquote.